Okay, I believe I'm now recording. And then I'm going to go to screen share so that I can go ahead and do the slides for everybody because I made fun slides. All right, if I can remember how to do this. So just bear with me. All right, what do you all see out of curiosity? Do you see
the screen? Christianity.
First page of a PowerPoint.
First page of a PowerPoint. Do you see my little slides on the side up here that I'm pointing at?
Yes.
Yep.
You do. Okay, so I do need to go to start PowerPoint. I was just wondering about that. Do you see exactly what I see? Okay. And then I'm going to read.
Yep, there we go.
Yes, there's it. Yep.
All right. Oh, here we go. Now I can sort of see everybody. All right. All right. So tonight, the question we're taking on is how do Christians respond to individuals who reject science, which is very much gets at the core of the relationship between Christianity and science. And as I'm sure you'll all be surprised, my answer is going to be, this is a really complicated question and isn't as easy as one thinks it is on the surface. So move this little sucker around. This is my ongoing issue here. All right. If you speak, just by the way, just interrupt me as we go along. You all know that is how I roll on things. So just interrupt with questions and just straight up interrupt me because I can't necessarily see you on Zoom. I'm still getting adjusted to that. The question is not as easy as it looks once you start to take the long view, right? On the surface, you think Christians should just take a side. We should either back up science or fight science. But when you take either one of those and you apply it to history, you realize you can't just say yes science or no science, because often science can be persecuted on one hand from outside forces, but other times science itself can be perverted by internal or external forces inside of it, either from inside or outside. And what I'm going to do tonight is I want to give you two different stories. One time where Christians opposed science when we really probably shouldn't have, or at least didn't have a good reason to, and another side where we probably should have spoken up against science, and we didn't, and that ended up in real tragedy, okay? So what do I mean? We're going to look at two historical examples. One of them you probably know the history of, which is sort of the story of the battle over evolution. The other one, however, is one that very few people know about, which is the story of eugenics in America.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so we'll hit the evolution one because that's the one people are usually more used to. So evolution, few important things we need to note here. First thing, the idea of evolution, everyone goes, oh, it's Charles Darwin, species of man sort of thing. Not really. It's worth noting that even early Christian thinkers were exposed to pre-Darwinistic understandings of evolution. Let's understand, like antiquity, you go back to ancient Rome and ancient Greeks, they were digging up dinosaur bones. They just didn't call them dinosaurs. So they had this idea that there was a time before humanity and a time in which there were these giant animals. Now, granted, in ancient Greece, often these were explained by the phoenixes or other mythical creatures. You dig up a pterodactyl, and the next thing you know, you have the story of the phoenix. Okay? So Christians, even in those early years, weren't unfamiliar with this idea of a time before humanity that doesn't match the Bible. And it's worth noting that, well, yes, there are Christians who will directly try to push back against that. There's a lot of Christians who are like, of course, there's a time before Christianity in the Bible. There's a time before, there's no problem with the story of Genesis. They often would point, in fact, to the story of Genesis 6, in which they talk about the Nephilim, which are supposedly a race of sort of heroes of old. And they would say, of course, you might have had Hercules, and of course, you might have defeated some sort of great monster, and you dug this monster up outside your town. That was just Genesis 6, guys, like no big deal. And if that was thousands of years, no big deal. We know this from the writing of St. Augustine. We know this from the writing of St. Aquinas. We know this from the early church father Origen, who would have been like 100 AD, 200 AD, so not far from the death of Christ. He was writing basically saying this is a non-conflict with our understanding of Christianity. Now, granted, there were other fathers like Tertullian who really took issue with it. So this sort of pushback from different parts of the church has existed from the beginning. Now, the sort of understanding of evolution we have scientifically really starts in 1859, when Darwin sets out the concept of evolution as we know it. It's worth noting that Darwin was a trained Anglican theologian. He actually went to seminary. He was offered to be ordained and declined it. So this idea that he is somehow a hostile actor to Christianity is really a historical non-starter. It's also a historical non-starter that Christianity is historically against Darwinism isn't true either. A lot of people will say, well, the church condemned him. No, they didn't. There were individual bishops who had issues. There were individual theologians who spoke up against Darwin's theories. But heck, there were scientists who spoke up against Darwin's theories. There was never an official declaration from the church against Darwin or the theory of evolution, either by the Church of England or the Roman Catholic Church, which would have been sort of the two predominant ones he would have bounced between, because he was obviously English, and Rome was, of course, the largest powerhouse at the time he lived. So the idea that there's this instant church hostility doesn't really play out. By the way, Darwin continues writing in the 1870s and passes away in the 1882. Okay, throughout his life, yeah, there were people who were mad at him, but there was no organized resistance. A bishop here, a pastor there, a theologian here, that sort of thing. So yeah, again, I don't want to say there wasn't any, but it was only one faction of the church and not a strong enough faction to get anything passed in the sense of saying this guy did something wrong. As for Darwin himself, he's definitely a religious man when he goes. He himself states he's a religious man when he comes back. As time goes on, he becomes more of what's called a deist, which is a person who believes that God created the world. But beyond that, he doesn't know what God did or did not do because he cannot prove it. It's worth noting most English clergy of his time would have been deists. It was sort of the popular theology of the time, or at least the popular sort of progressive theology of its time. So that he would not have been seen as weird. Then comes evangelical Christianity. Now, this is one of those things, if you don't know Christian history really well, it's hard to wrap your brain around. It's hard to wrap your brain around because in evangelical Christianity, they always cast it as, we are the conservatives, we're upholding tradition, right? This is how Christians used to believe. But the reality is evangelicalism, as we know it in America, has only really existed since about the time of the Civil War. So like if you were to get in a time machine and go back to 1800, 60 years before the Civil War, you wouldn't find anyone who described themselves as evangelicals, and you really wouldn't find literalists. You'd find some people who were more literal, some people who were less literal, but no one who would say, well, I'm taking the Bible absolutely literally. That simply wasn't an idea back then, okay? It becomes an idea with the onset of the Civil War, because you have a group of folks who say, I take the Bible literally, and therefore I can back slavery. Those groups will become the evangelicals of today denominationally. So that's why you have these Southern Baptists, because they broke from the National Baptists to back the Southern cause, hence the name Southern. You guys all following so far? I can't see faces, so this always makes me super nervous.
I know there's a controversy about keeping our evangelical in the name.
Yes, there is. And I will be honest, I would drop it in a heartbeat if I could. Which puts me at direct odds with the presiding bishop, who's taken a very strong stance to keeping it. So, but
Interesting.
yeah, we can go down that rabbit hole any day you want. That's like one of my personal little soapboxes. I can talk on that forever. But okay, moving on. So modern evangelicalism comes out of that. Now, evangelicalism, since its birth, has had a cycle with us mainline. So when I say evangelicals, I'm talking non-denominationals, Southern Baptists, any of the holiness movements, any of those sorts of groups.
Fundamentalists. We'll just call them fundamentalists. We don't then we don't have to worry about being evangelicals, right?
Okay, so within the evangelical community, they have subgroups of individuals.
Oh,
So
okay.
you can be evangelical who is not a fundamentalist, and you can be a fundamentalist who's not a literalist. And you can be a literalist who's not a Pentecostal. So Pentecostalism, charismaticism, fundamentalism, and literalism are subgroups of which you can be any combination thereof within the umbrella that is evangelicals. Boy, yeah, exactly. It's just worth knowing. So a literalist takes the Bible literally. A fundamentalist believes that there's a fundamental set of principles that, if violated, ceases your relationship with Christ. Okay? Now, the weird thing about the history of fundamentalism is that the original fundamentalists were trying to see if you could find like a handful of values that every denomination could sign on to as a base, as sort of a ecumenical movement to try to bring Christianity together. But it sounds like, okay, that's not a bad idea, right? Well, what ended up happening was everyone wrote their own script and said, well, these 20 things you have to believe. And someone else went, no, these 21 things. You don't believe this one, and so you're out of the boat. So the fundamentalism then just sort of became this, do you have a set of fundamental principles that have to be followed? The main lines are sort of the historical churches: Lutherans, United Methodists, Episcopalians, United Churches of Christ, Disciples of Christ, the American Baptists, that sort of group of folks. We all sort of work together. We have very similar virtues and values. And the great irony is we rejected the fundamentalist movement and are now working on ecumenical relationships. We as the ELCA can swap clergy with 8 of the 19 main lines at this point. And we're working on it in all the others. So the irony is we are fulfilling the dream that the original fundamentalists had. Well, the people who call themselves fundamentalists aren't, because that's how history works sometimes, because history is weird. Great question. I love this sort of stuff. All right, so moving back to things. So you start this cycle between mainlines and evangelicals. And the cycle basically goes this way. Evangelicals attach to something that is politically really important, okay? And they bear down on the politically important thing or the politically popular thing, and they ride that sucker as long as they can. So the first one that they do is slavery. They say, we are for slavery, and therefore what they do is they absorb huge chunks of the main lines of people who were in the main lines and for slavery, because most of the main lines came out and said slavery is wrong. Okay, so if you're a United Methodist and you're in the South, you're like, but I like slavery. I want to keep this. And my church just said I'm doing something that's immoral. Well, heck with my church. I'm going to leave and do this. Okay. And it then grows popular support among those who are like, you know what? I want to go to a church that's saying what I believe. They go there. And so they run for a while, and then usually they add more and more political things, except for the problem evangelicals have historically is because their selling point is God believes just like you, join our church. It becomes really hard when society completely moves along and says, you know what, that belief after all is really a bad idea. Okay, so what ends up happening is they grow for a while, they hook onto some sort of belief that is going to be a non-starter in a few generations. Their populations crash because they get linked for a number of generations to slavery, for example. Slavery gets defeated after Civil War. The population's opinion on slavery shifts against it, even in the South. And therefore, evangelicals can't just turn around and say, oh, never mind, the Bible literally said that yesterday, but literally says this another day. That doesn't fly. And they go sort of underground. Usually it's when the main lines take off. We have our own problem because when we are flying solo and have no challenge from the evangelicals, we often grow massive bureaucracies that then crush us under their own weight. And so we'll get up and then we'll start to go down. And usually at about that time, the evangelicals have remade their package and say, well, now this is the set of beliefs that God says is absolutely true. And they'll hook onto a whole nother set of political or cultural ideas and then ride that until it eventually crashes. And so we start this cycle.
Oh my God.
Okay. And you can almost see this cycle going on right now. Evangelicals in 2020, when they do their reports, have already said that they're going to be showing massive losses in attendance, where most main lines have started stabling out attendance, though main lines have been losing attendance since about the 1960s. So it looks like we are probably hitting the bottom of our curve as they have hit the peak and are coming over theirs. So it looks like we're about to start another cycle, which would make sense because the evangelicals hook themselves to a number of political ideas that are starting to age on them, that probably aren't going to fly in 2 or 3 generations. So by the 1890s, they've gone through the first part of the cycle. That's why I went into it. Slavery was a great idea for them as a growth strategy. Then it crashed after the Civil War. It's the 1890s, so you're far enough away from the Civil War now because you're 30 years later, and you're thinking to yourself, well, I need to start getting some sort of issue to hook onto. And that is when you start to have evangelicals just start working on the idea of pushing back against evolution and science in general. Because they see this area in which you have a large number of folks for cultural and other reasons who are really skeptical of a lot of the science stuff. And so they see an opportunity to begin to work in that direction. This sort of comes to a head in the famous Scopes monkey trial, right, in the 1920s, where you have a teacher teaching evolution, which violated Tennessee law. And so the teacher goes ahead and gets put on trial. And people forget, the teacher actually lost that trial. The news media and the world sort of woke up and went, oh my goodness, do we want to be that sort of people? And so the irony is, they won the trial. Starting at that point, evolution as an idea starts picking up more and more steam. And it really shifts from laws against evolution being taught at all to where we are now on the issue, which is in the 90s, evangelicals went back to the evolution issue and said, well, I want to, instead of saying I'm against evolution, I'm going to say, well, I want to teach evolution and creationism in schools, which is one of the things they picked up in the 90s during their rise then, which is different than their position in the 20s, which was that evolution shouldn't be taught at all by anybody. Questions or thoughts?
Is that where the idea comes that, I can't remember what you call it, where they take the Bible and say, well, this is what it fits with science?
So like intelligent design theory, which was what was pushed for a while, was the idea that you should at least teach that there's an intelligent designer. Now, again, this is one of the ironies of history, because technically arguing that God is an intelligent designer would have been something that Darwin himself, as a good deist, would have been incredibly okay with. So there's an irony in that, which is sort of what they attached onto in the 90s to say, well, you should teach evolution, but alongside it, you should teach intelligent design. And again, I don't get into political commentary. I'm just looking at tactics and sort of theological history here. I just, again, I like to point out sort of the irony of things when they happen historically, because I find history really amusing. So that's sort of where that came out to. Now, in this whole scenario, it's worth noting that there are a lot of Christians, even within the main lines, who really hook into this idea and really push back against science in the 1920s, saying, well, no, anyone who believes in evolution is evil, which, by the way, is very different, again, than what evangelicals say today. They're just it's a different world, okay? Because I'm trying to give everyone a fair shake here, you know me. So I would say this is a great example of where theologians and Christians oppose science when they really didn't need to, okay? Because again, you can believe in God, you can believe in a Christian God, and you can easily believe in evolution. And we knew that in the 1920s because we had these folks who were who were going ahead and already had written on it all the way back to like 1200s with St. Augustine and Thomas and Aquinas and other folks like that. All right, moving on. Are we good moving on this one?
Yep.
All right. Okay, so we're going to move to a different subject. I'm going to tell you the story of eugenics. So in 1822, through 1911, Sir Francis Galton is this prolific writer of sort of academic papers. Now, they're all over the place. They're in anthropology, psychology, zoology. He's a sort of Renaissance guy. He writes 300 plus peer-reviewed books and papers on eugenics, but on other things too. But that was definitely his shtick. In fact, in 1883, he actually is the founder of this entire scientific realm called eugenics. Eugenics was the idea that government and or through either economic and or health policy could mimic nature's natural selection to create better societies. So it was along with the sort of philosophical social Darwinist movement, in which you would go ahead and say, you know, if I want to make society better, we need to make sure we select the good people and keep them around, and then keep the bad people from breeding more bad people, whatever you defined as good and bad. By 1902, Charles B. Davenport, who's the head of the Department of Zoology at the University of Chicago, so, you know, just 2 hours south of here, with funding from the Carnegie Foundation, establishes the Biological Experiment Station for the Study of Evolution. This is the ironic tie here, in which he goes ahead and goes out to Cold Harbor and campus and actually establishes an entire school to study evolution, but how you could interfere with evolution. Now, he does this initially under the idea of breeding better cattle and breeding better plants, but by 1910, he has branched out from animals and is starting to branch out to humans. He expands his operation with growing financial support through a number of independent philanthropists, including his largest donor, which was John Kellogg, as in the founder of Kellogg Company. And then the American Breeders Association, which sounds innocent, but this is a political pro-eugenics, sort of what we would call as a PAC now, organization. In coordination with the president of Stanford University, he creates the Department of Experimental Evolutionary Studies at Stanford, and then creates an equivalent one at the University of Chicago. The second Stanford creates this, they start getting a huge influx of students interested in it, and therefore it starts a massive race across universities across the United States, and then very soon after that, Europe, to found their own eugenics departments in their universities. The one slight interesting thing here is there is some evidence that Dartmouth resisted this out of all the Ivy Leagues. But the rest of them, including Yale and Harvard and sort of the equivalents over in Europe, like Oxford and Cambridge, all jumped on this bandwagon very quickly. By the 1930s, the United States and most European countries had ongoing forced sterilization practices actively embraced as part of government health and economic policies. It's worth noting this is a real human tragedy. We know of at least 60,000 plus forced sterilizations in the United States itself. Most of these are going to be folks who had mental or physical disabilities, though it does take two different dimensions on. Most of it that occurs before the 1930s will occur on the West Coast, particularly California, though Connecticut and New York, this was also widely distributed. And that will focus on people with mental health and physical disabilities, particularly people with learning disabilities. It will take a different road in the South, who will primarily use this on ethnic minorities. Virginia being the largest purveyor of this. By the 1920s, the journal Science, the Carnegie Foundation, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Zoological Society, most Ivy League universities, Planned Parenthood, Alexander Graham Bell, Winston Churchill, John Maynard Keynes, as in the founder of Keynesian economic theory, and Woodrow Wilson, as in the president during the First World War, among many others, openly endorsed eugenics as a valid scientific and policy route. Then really comes the mid to late 1930s. And this is where theologians really should hang their heads in shame. Progressive theologians, and I need to note that because the word progressive in theology means something fundamentally different than in politics, okay? A progressive theologian is a person who embraces the idea that God is making the world as we are making it. In other words, we are progressing towards the oncoming kingdom of God, and through social action and political intervention, we can make the world a juster place and sort of help the arc of justice bend towards freedom and justice, okay? That's what a progressive theologian means. So you can be conservative, you could be liberal. It doesn't have political implications, just the idea that we participate in bending the arc of justice towards something good, okay? Or the arc of history towards something good. This is dominant among Lutheran theologians in Germany, who had been heavily influenced by Martin Heidegger and Friedrich Nietzsche. And they turn around and spend a good portion of the early 1930s, late 1920s, providing ethical frameworks for eugenics as a way to bend the arc of history towards justice in their writings. For us, with hindsight, we can quickly see how such justifications were quickly seized on by the Nazi Party, and we all know how that ended. The Nazis themselves did also do forced sterilizations of at least 400,000 people, but the records indicate that it's probably many, many more, if not into the millions. That's just the ones that have been proven. The other weird part of this is there were forced sterilizations in the US all the way into the 1970s. So even after the atrocities of the Holocaust, even after it really fell out within the academic community post-World War II, this idea of eugenics from a policy position lags all the way into the 1970s, when it's finally stomped out. It's worth noting that this hasn't been completely stomped out. You could go to a number of Ivy League schools still today and would find ethicists, particularly in environmental science ethics and medical ethics, that would advocate some version of non-coercive eugenics, particularly in the recent years within different corners. Again, ironically enough, in Stanford and Berkeley in particular. Their ethics departments have sort of gone back down this road. And so this is a point where I bring this up because these are two very different stories, right? One story about how Christianity, if we just said yes to science, would have been right the first time, but we were tragically wrong the second. And had we just said no to science, that would have saved us from eugenics, but it would have hurt us with evolution. And so a lot of where Christianity falls in regards to science and faith ends up breaking out by different groups. So evangelicals and atheists, ironically enough, are in agreement that science and faith are opposing forces. So if you read evangelical theologians, their goal will be to tear down science because they see science as an opposition force to faith. It's ironic, which is, by the way, an atheist writer would try to tear down religion because they see it as an opposition to science. So they're both in agreement that there's a war, they're just on two different sides. Now, another view of it comes out of the Catholic, the Neo-Orthodox, and the Eastern Orthodox communities that would say science has its place. It's a study of the physical world, but the spiritual world includes the physical world. Therefore, science is subordinate to theology. So they're in conversation, but it's not a conversation of equals. This is why Catholicism will have no problem going ahead and coming out against Catholics who are scientists and say, you have violated Catholic law, you need to stop, or we'll forbid you from having communion, or we'll do some sort of retribution, okay? Because the opinion of the Roman Catholic Church is that science must be subordinate to theology. Then mainline Protestants, which is what we are, have traditionally taken the position that science and theology should be in some sort of dialogue, okay? Now, I would argue that the mainlines probably have the best relationship with science because at least on the surface treats them as equals. I have not seen, my personal opinion is I think there's a whole different road. I think there's a fourth road to go down that I think would be healthier. I've watched a lot of these dialogues between science and theology, and what you really have is two people talking two different languages, walking by each other because the methodologies are so different. The primary clash being that theology in theology, it is okay for me to describe a world that never could be and tell you to do that. Where in science or any other academic field, you're always restrained by your resources and your abilities, right? So if you're an economist and I was to tell you, please get rid, make all trade perfectly equal where there's never an immoral thing that occurs, you'll just be like, that's an impossible thing. I'm going to ignore you now, right? So it's the same sort of thing. So I don't think those dialogues honestly work particularly well. It works better than the other two ideas. So I would say that honestly, the way people should move forward on this is to build a system whereby we as Christians can be the guardians of science. Because see, what happened in evolution was that science did its job well, and we persecuted it unfairly. What happened in eugenics was science didn't do its job well, and we let it run amok. So maybe the lesson that I suggest we take is that we should be really critical, but not in the adversarial sense to science, that we should call science to be really good science. And when science ceases being really good science, we should say, hey, your methodologies are weak, or hey, you're completely ignoring an entire other realm of discussion, or hey, do you realize that, yes, this sounds great from a biological standpoint, eugenicist, but have you ever thought about the political implications of how that would work? Because I'm telling you, you're not talking to your political scientists because they are losing their minds going, oh my God, this is going to be horribly abused. Or your ethicists who are going, this is a terrifying idea. Okay? And so I honestly think that one of the things that religion can do uniquely is to call for the intersectionality of the different disciplines with each other. Because too often one discipline just declares itself right, doesn't check in with any others, and then goes off some sort of cliff. And it can also be the defender, because a lot of times there's outside forces that do unfairly attack science. And religion can totally step in and say, listen, we're not them. We do something totally different. But why are you attacking them? That's not okay. And I think there's a way in time that religion could really be a sort of neutral arbiter, calling everyone back to sort of humility. So anyways, that's my thoughts. What are y'all's thoughts on this? I felt like I talked a lot this evening, so I'm going to be quiet.
Well, a comment you made just a few minutes ago about eugenics did its job very poorly, and then, but religion didn't stand up to it, or, people of faith. But I kind of, when you look at it apart from ethics, if you take it completely, I mean, that's exactly what breeders do on a regular basis. They're looking at how to bring out the best possible qualities while inhibiting recessive traits and so on and so forth, which is a form of eugenics. Yes. And I'm just looking at that and needing the balance. It's almost eugenics. I'm not sure, because I don't know enough about it to say, did it do its job poorly, or was it actually highlighting, putting a spotlight on, would this be advantageous could we do this? Could we even work on, trying to take disease out of our line or whatever? But of course it went down a horrible path, and without having that balance and that kind of a broader view of looking, saying, but wait, what are you going to do with this kind of information? So I don't know if I guess, as a pure science. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
No, so that's why I talked about intersectionality, because like if you look at the story of eugenics, one group that is very critical of it from the get-go is the political science world and the economics world, which, by the way, still holds true today. Those are the two worlds that are probably the most critical of what goes on in the eugenics space, even among sort of the new non-coercive ideas. So a good example of this is you have some major economists who came out and basically said, that if you were to offer, and again, this is talking about non-coercive versus coercive. If you were to offer non-coercive eugenics, you would further exacerbate the rich versus the poor, because in non-coercive eugenics, you would pay to go ahead and get rid of or to enhance your IQ, for example.
Mhm.
Well, if you're paying for it, obviously the richer you are, the more reliable and better service you're going to get, right? Because that's just economics. And therefore you would exacerbate the sort of permanent status of poor among one group of people, because this group would literally be able to equip themselves in a way you couldn't. And by the way, it's the same discussion if you're talking about like concept of cyborg stuff, if you go down that road. I mean, that's not necessarily, I mean, it's an ethical issue. I don't want to say it's not ethical issue, but even if you were to take ethics out of there, you have an economic issue that would be really difficult. And in the original eugenics, you had a lot of political scientists come out and say, you give the government the power to go ahead and forcibly sterilize groups of people, they're going to run amok with that. Because once you give the government power to really dictate something at that level that's that personal and violate the individual rights of any group.
Oh, yeah.
That's
just it. I mean, it's one person, again, what human nature seems to always want to go to is not looking at what is in the best interest type thing, but I have more power than you. I get to do my thing because I happen to be in a place. And that's where putting real like power or knowledge about something isn't necessarily a good thing, because I'm going to say the wrong people, but that maybe isn't a good way to say it, because they are all bad people. But I just
right.
that long view. Yeah. So I can see how that would be horrible, but wow.
So that's what I would say is, like, if the theologians had gone with my plan, obviously my plan didn't exist back then, the theologians wouldn't have stepped up and railed necessarily from an ethics standpoint, though I think that would have been a legitimate move too. But they might have been able to encourage those early early eugenicists to talk to the political scientists and listen to the political scientists and listen to the economist who's going to have serious concerns about how you could possibly do this in an ethical manner, or even a manner that doesn't lead to some sort of really dark, horrible place.
Yeah.
Well, there's been discussion. I just listened to something. I don't, probably NPR again, but that they're starting to zero in on how they can improve, not specifically, but in a very general sense. You could isolate and improve someone's IQ, a new person. Now they go down that road and they say, well, maybe we can do that, but by doing that, we may introduce in that same being, we may introduce some disease, something else that you don't, that you weren't, that if it was just happening naturally without any scientific interference, that it could turn, you could turn out that you enhance something, but you end up with something that would make that person's life be shortened for some reason,
Absolutely.
potentially.
And
you lose creativity, you lose empathy, you lose something else. I'm challenged by the ethical side of it because of all the cases of misuse of it. That's the kindest term I can come to. It's blatantly wrong. The Missouri appendectomy, which have been happening as late as the 1980s and 90s. Some of the things that are happening in prison systems, just because the technology exists, it can be exploited for bad, because of power.
Absolutely.
How do you, once it's out of the bottle, the genie's out, what do we do?
Well, and let me introduce a whole nother dynamic to it. So let's say you have a way to, let's say you come up with a program where you're going to you're going to give someone a shot, and we're going to make it free to everybody, and it will up your IQ on your IQ test by 100 points. Okay. And we somehow can do that without any other side effects. Okay. So on the surface, you would think, well, that would be ethical. There'd be no downside, right? But here's the problem. We know that the IQ test itself has internal bias, right? Like, the whiter you are, the richer you are, the more coastal you are, the more urban you are, the more New England or West Coast you are, the better you do in an IQ test. But that's
Right.
not because those people are smarter. That's because a lot of times they use language and terminology that is more common in those areas. They're never going to ask you to find the mud bug. They're going to ask you to find the crayfish.
Mhm.
Okay? They're going to ask you questions about yachting, not about volleyball.
And they won't ask you how many fields of corn will fit in that silo.
No, they're not going to
Right.
ask you that. So you're going to have certain communities with natural like things. So even if you somehow upped people's IQ, then what are you actually upping? Are you perhaps doing some sort of, you know, if you were able to create a cocktail that actually made people do better, are you really making
We
them
all
smarter,
becoming
or are you culturally adapting them somehow? You know what I mean? Like,
becoming a cyborg then are we
Well-
becoming, there's no difference. And what Deborah said too about breeding is, you know, and I understand breeding in the sense of more healthy animals, but also breeding in the sense that when you think about dogs, I mean, that's, to me, I think that's subjective too. I mean, subjective in the sense that you want their coat to be a certain way and their tail to be a certain way and their this and that, and then in a dog show championship, those are to me, I think those are more subjective than they are objective. Just like it's subjective as to, you know, if your knowledge base, or if you're, if you know how to be a farmer as opposed to knowing how to be an engineer, I mean, or whatever. So I mean, it's, or, you know, if you East Coast, West Coast, if my IQ goes up 100 points, if you drop me in the Amazon basin, who lives and who dies? And you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
so,
having-
Your point, Lisa, exactly about breeding, because what's happened is people learned enough, maybe not enough what they needed to, but that's just what happened. People who had the power, and because there was no one advocating for, let's say in this case, the animal, you have breeds that should never exist. You have dogs that could never survive. And you have the most superficial traits being pulled out, and yet that breed will carry many recessive inadequacies, but those are just glossed over. Nobody seems to pay attention. So, but it goes right along with that. Indeed, it's just how a person, once you've given them the power of how to do this, you leave it up to then that person who has that in their hands to say, how do I want to use it, and for what gain? That's the scary part.
Absolutely. And I think there's a good question if humanity could ever get to a place in which giving them that power over other humans would lead to anything else but that. Because perhaps there's something in human nature that simply makes that road always a fraught and dangerous one. Because again, and this isn't necessarily, I mean, I would say that I would have lots of religious backing for that, lots of theological backing, but I wouldn't have to go to theology. I wouldn't even have to go to ethics. So again, ethics, I think, would back me up on that. Political science and economics would back me up on that. You know, if you want to go to places where morality doesn't necessarily matter, you know? And so I think that's why we can really, as a religious community, could really, if we could get over some of the more adversarial roles we pick sometimes, if we were able to build that relationship with the academy again that we once had in the Middle Ages, then we could get to a place where we could really help make sure that everyone's actually communicating with each other. Because like the thing that that in my own personal experience that just floors me is that I did political science and economics as an undergraduate, and then I went on to do seminary, so it's a Master's of Divinity, which is a 4-year program. So what was most jarring to me is that there would be statements, like factual statements in political science, that theologians simply would say, "Oh no, I'm sorry, consensus has decided that's not true." And I'd be like, but political science says that this thing about politics is in fact true, or at least a valid place to talk. And then theologians would be like, no, in theology, you can't talk that way. In theology, that's not a thing. And I'd run into the same thing with economics. They say, well, economics says blah, 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 blah. And they go, oh, well, consensus in theology says that's not real. And I'd be like, but it's about economics. Don't economists get to decide what's real? And they'd be like, well, this is theology, so we don't. And in all honesty, I had friends who did theology who took economics classes, and I can remember them being like, well, theology says XYZ about like ethics or something, and the economics professors being like, oh, this is an economist class, we don't care about ethics. You're like, okay, well, that's not good. You know. And so I think making.
But an economist can't stay siloed away from an ethicist and can't stay siloed away from a theologian. So everything ends up being crossing, and you cross per, you know. So you have to. I mean, just like, I mean, you know, I understand we all would love to be, you know, be able to I suppose create a, you know, from creation, from genetics, be healthier and not have to worry about cancer and all these things and whatever. But when you start going down that road, I mean, we could end up that some virus, because we've done this, some virus ends up wiping us all out.
Absolutely. And there may be non-eugenic ways of going down there that are ethical. And maybe there is going to be something in that realm that somehow is ethical. I mean, I can't conceive of how that would be, but that's what I'm saying. Like, maybe the role of the community in Christianity is to work on the inside of the academy and sort of promote the intersectionality, because it is so easy. And I would honestly argue it's human nature to sort of self-silo ourselves when we become experts on something, because it is so hard to translate from one field's vocabulary to another. We just go, oh, well, heck, I don't want to talk to those people. I'm going to just talk to the people who already use the vocabulary that I know, and we'll figure it out because we're the experts on this anyways.
Yeah.
And
I think
that
times during history, isn't it also true that different branches of either science or theology maybe, or whatever, has different levels of relevance or expertise or respect, and then they lose it. And then at another time in history, well, we're not listening to those people at all because they don't anything. We're not even going to invite them to the table. And then, like you said, maybe 100 years later, those tables have turned a little bit.
absolutely. And I think,
Okay.
no, go for it, Lisa.
I'm just going to say, even within science itself, there's just so much, you know, jockeying for position of, you know, who's, you know, physicists versus, you know, biology versus physiology versus what they call the soft science. You know, some people would say, you know, look at a sociologist and say they're not really scientists, you know. So there's a lot of you know, discrimination even amongst themselves that it's, you know, so it's, you know, it's just interesting that, yeah. So you can put science in a big old group, but then say, well, you know, whether you believe in them or not, but there's a lot within the scientific community, within social sciences and other things that even from a theological standpoint, you know, totally makes sense and totally, you know, falls in line. I mean, it may not present itself in the way of faith or grace or spirituality, but it does present itself in you know, what, healthy self-esteem and concept, you know, that whole idea that, you know, and just kindness and empathy and how that helps your, you know, good brain health, basically, you know. So there's another, you know, intersection again. So
I think that experiment that one scientist did with the CRISPR thing with the twins, that was all on the news, where he changed some genetic kind of thing with the twins in China, I think it was.
Yep.
And then that raised a big uproar within not just churches, but within science itself.
Mhm.
It was talking about ethics. Is that ethical to do that?
And I think one of the reasons the church, who does say a lot of things about a lot of things, one of the problems the church has is I think the church is just as siloed often, especially with theologians, as a lot of these academicians. So don't hear me just beating up on the academicians. In fact, I would argue that the average college probably does a much better job than the average seminary at making sure that sort of intersectionality discussions occur. I don't know how many times I have listened to some theologian online just go on about something, and I'm sitting here just banging in my head going like, you are missing the entire debate that's occurring in whatever field. Like, you're just not talking about the same thing. Like, you're just not getting it. You know, and I'm like, I understand why the scientists don't want to talk to you. I think the best example of that was back in around 2000, Trinity Church on Wall Street, which is a really prestigious, incredibly rich Episcopal church right on Wall Street, invited the Archbishop of Canterbury at the time, Rowan Williams, who was quite the academician, a number of lead theologians from around the world, and a number of lead economists, including the famous economist Jeffrey Sachs out of Harvard, to come and talk about globalization. And so like, I was like super interested because, you know, economics background, all this. And like, it was this beautiful, beautiful idea, beautifully put together. And it was a complete like dumpster fire. Because what happened was the economists got up there, explained the very nuanced, very different sort of economic arguments about globalization. And they had people all the way from like Noam Chomsky on one end, all the way to, you know, Austrian guys on the other, and everyone in between. And so you have all this very nuanced, you know, positions, and then you just get a group of theologians up there, and they were just like, end globalization. I don't want trade to happen. Let's get rid of currency. And the economists are like, none of us are for getting rid of currency. Like, and from Noam Chomsky all the way to the other side, no one wants to ban currency because that's like an economic disaster waiting to occur. You know, again, Noam Chomsky all the way to the strongest Austrian, no one wants to end trade. Like, you know, even like, you know, a socialist quote government of like Sweden still has IKEA, guys. Like, no one's in that zone anymore, right? At the same time, you know, no one, you know, they say, well, all you guys just want to go ahead and, you know, have social Darwinism and complete free markets. And even the Austrians don't want complete free markets. So, you know, it's one of those sorts of situations. Bye, Fred. Sorry I lost you there. If you guys need to go, you just tell me and I'll say bye. But, you know, and end up just, when they interviewed both the theologians and the economists afterwards, after this like 5-day summit, the theologians were like, I don't feel like anyone listened to me. And the economists are like, theologians just want to have their cake and eat it too. When they decide to check in with reality, we'll talk to them. So it was this complete just mess. And they never did it again. And it's really sad because what you really had, in all honesty, was a whole bunch of definitionary differences. Because when a theologian says socialism, they would mean Sweden. When an economist, at least in 2000, said socialism, they mean the USSR. You know, when a theologian says capitalism, they mean unbridled, pure capitalism in which there is no government intervention whatsoever, okay? Which doesn't exist anywhere. And when a economist said capitalism, at least back in 2000, this has changed a little bit, they would have meant any form of free market. So you had things that were some form of free market and things that were command markets. And those were sort of your two worlds. And they would say there's a third of protectionist markets, but that would have been sort of the two worlds that the economists are operating in. Where the theologian operates in, you have capitalism, which is unbridled, or socialism, which is what we all have. Which is honestly where I think they all just went off in their conversations, because literally one's definition of capitalism was the other's definition of socialism.
Waste of time.
Yeah, it was a waste of time. Yeah. So, well, it has been an hour, so I always like to say goodbye to anyone who is like, I don't know if I should leave. So, but you know me, I will keep talking. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording at this point, if that's cool with you all.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Yep.